No matter where you go in the world, you will certainly run into someone of a different language, belief, and culture who will have something to say about Jesus. Why is that? How is it that Jesus, a Jewish rabbi who lived over 2,000 years ago, continues to captivate people worldwide and is still the most fascinating figure of all time? In this episode, I will be talking with Jim Wallace, a former cold case detective and renowned Christian casemaker, to gain insight into the enduring appeal of Jesus by utilizing some of his investigative skills to explore the historical and scientific evidence for the existence and divinity of Jesus. Jim, my friend, thanks for joining me on Challenging Conversations.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This is a good topic as we approach, it's been the season of the fall around the holidays. So it's a good topic to discuss for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was talking to my producer about it, I was thinking I got to get Jim on because when you had come out with Person of Interest, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible a few years ago, and I was at the time kind of diving into studying and researching my book, Hijacking Jesus, I love the fact where you give a case for Jesus inside the canonical Gospels as well as outside the canonical Gospels. And a lot of the evidence that you put together, again, using your cold case detective, background, which you're so good at, and it's so fascinating. I was thinking, man, this is brilliant. If every single Christian could understand the compelling evidence that we have for Jesus inside the canonical Gospels, like defending the credibility of what we have in the Bible, as well as understanding things outside of the Bible, I mean, this is overwhelming, Jim. So I was so thankful that you were able to put your skills to the test, if you will, examining the life of Jesus Christ. So I know a lot of people who listen and watch the show are familiar with your backstory, but I want to dive right in because one thing I'm looking forward to is as we really generate some of this buzz during the Christmas season of looking at the evidence of Jesus, I also want people to be able to learn from you about how to respond to certain objections. And this is clearly something you do very well in the Person of Interest book. But I want to start with a quote that you have in the book. And you say here, and I'm going to respond with a question, say, why would someone trust this ancient collection of carefully crafted myths? This tale of a miracle working Jesus who thought he was God might have been impressive to ancient sheep herders and farmers, but why would anyone raised in the 20th century or beyond believe it? Why would anyone think this ancient fictional character matters? Now, as I read that, and knowing your backstory, of course, this is you investigating. This is when you started to have these inquiries, right? Where you're an atheist and you're asking these questions. Why would people even care about this Jesus? Why is Christianity, here still to this day when we live in this modern scientific era? So I got to ask you, what sparked your interest in examining the Gospels as credible sources on the subject of Jesus Christ?
Well, okay. So that most of the stuff I talk about in my investigations of these claims is really the skepticism that I held, right? And we have a tendency, I think, to look at um, things from antiquity as primitive, right? We would say, look, people were primitive. They didn't know much. Or they were easily fooled. And that was my view of anything that came out of antiquity related to claims about God. So I just wasn't really interested for most of my life. And then my wife, as I look back at, we were talking about this the other day. I think part of it was, if you have young children and you're looking to put them into preschool,
Yeah.
because you think, oh, I want to get them ready for kindergarten, like as if we need to get our kids ready for kindergarten, right? But anyway, I mean, it used to be that kindergarten was the
Yeah.
thing that got you ready for school. But we put our kids in preschool, and a lot of preschools are run by Christian churches. And so we did have our kids in a Christian preschool when we, in fact, were not believers.
Mm.
That was just what was available in our area. And when the kids were then school age, the question was, well, should they kind of went through a system at the church for preschool? Should we continue to develop those kinds of moral foundations? And I thought, no, listen, I wouldn't have chosen the Christian preschool to begin with, but
Right.
any preschool would have been fine with me. So a lot of it was, I think, because of that we ended up in an evangelical church. And I pushed back. I mean, I spent 3 years denying the offer. I didn't. We were in this community that we're living in now for about 3 years before I agreed to go, and there was this huge kind of seeker sensitive church that was in the neighborhood that we went to, where the pastor, I think, really had his eyes on folks who were visiting, who were still not in the fold. And the
Hmm.
way he pitched Jesus was very commonsensical. I mean, very relatable. He just said that Jesus was smart, super smart, the smartest man who ever lived, and that's a bold claim.
Yeah.
And I could have easily written it off, but I bought a Bible instead to see if that
Mm.
was true, not to prove him wrong. Lee Strobel's a friend of both of ours, and Lee was trying to prove Leslie wrong. That wasn't we
Right.
didn't I didn't have anyone to prove wrong. We weren't it. But I was interested in smart guys, and when I read the Gospels, I realized that they have a texture which is testable. And
Mm.
so, for example, if you were to read the spiritual writings of Baha'u'llah, the leader of the Baha'i faith,
Yep.
that prophet is not going to give you the foundation that you can test the way you test historical accounts or the way you test claims about something that's rooted in a timeline. Now, this is what casework is, right? All criminal casework is exploring claims about something that happened in a timeline. Baha'u'llah does not make any claims about something that happened in a timeline. He just makes prophetic utterances about the quality of life. It's like fortune cookie theology. How do you test a fortune cookie? You really can't, unless the fortune cookie says, in 1902 this happened. Oh, well,
Right.
that's different. That's
Right.
a testable claim. So this is what provoked me to test the accounts to begin with. And what I also saw was that these accounts have variances. Some of these variances have been pointed out by skeptics to say, well, you can't trust them because there's a degree of variation between the accounts. Well, there's a degree of variation between every eyewitness I've ever investigated, some of which I have to work really hard to understand because the defense attorney is going to make a big deal out of these things when we get to trial.
Hmm.
So I need to know, how do I explain this variation? And so we have to kind of think about it, especially when you've got other evidence that demonstrates he's our guy. Then
Right.
they're going to point out this red herring. They're going to point to this variance to try to make a case against it. Well, I need to know, how do I describe this? What really happened? Like, why
Mm.
is there a variance? And so that's the kind of work that we do in every criminal case. So I just decided to take that approach with the Gospels, and that's what really got me started. And when I got done, so you can make a case two way, like you said before, you can make a case from the inside out and from the outside in. And I expect there to be both cases. If you've got a set of eyewitnesses that are making certain claims, I expect there to be some form of corroborative evidence on the outside in that will help me determine if those claims are reliable. And that's exactly the approach I took with the gospel authors. And look, here's the thing that I think that most skeptics who really don't want to listen to anything we're talking about today will argue for a certain level of perfection in the case that is not available in any case. And we have to instruct jurors about this because there's this sense from watching TV that you can create these cases that are just so there's not any open
Right.
questions left. There's no degree of doubt left. We've got this, like we've got a video camera, like where we can see everything that happened. That's not the way the cases really work. You have to make inferences, the best inference you can from the best evidence you can, and you've got to get comfortable with your open questions. And so I think if you do that with this case, you'll find that it is more than sufficient. And so that's really where I ended up.
Yeah, I mean it's powerful. I mean we can obviously have just an entire episode on your testimony. Maybe we'll have you back in the new year or something to do that because it is fascinating. We do get a lot of people who are skeptics who are, inquiring or looking into the case, if you will, for Christianity. So what I want to do is, because as I continue to flow through your Person of Interest book, there was that
Mhm.
point where you made a very, very powerful statement, and this is what I want to draw people's attention to now and ask you a question. You say in your book, I didn't need the evidence provided by the gospel. So you just said when the pastor had said that Jesus was the smartest person who ever lived, and you grabbed a Bible and you started to read the gospels, you saw there was a texture to it. And you saw that, oh, these things could be testable. Like, I'm going to look into this. And so obviously, fast forward all these years later, you're a Christian. But when you look back at that time, you said you didn't need the evidence provided by the gospels to know the truth about Jesus. So what credible evidence, Jim, can you share with us that we have about Jesus outside of the gospels?
Okay, so let me just say one thing before we jump into that. And that is that I get this question a lot. Like you don't have any contemporary accounts of Jesus outside the Gospels. Well, look, everything we know about Jesus, we know from the Gospels. But the
Right.
question I have is, why do we need anything outside the Gospels to begin with? Imagine this. Imagine this. So here's what they're saying. Hey, there are other early, in the Common Era, very early accounts from non Christians related to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But those people come a generation after the gospel accounts.
Right.
So you can't count, they're not contemporary. Okay. So imagine this then. The question I have is not, is there anything outside the gospels? It's why is it you don't trust what the gospels say?
Yeah.
So here's what I would say. Let's say we had a home invasion robbery and there's four members of the family who were robbed. And those four members of the family have been later interviewed and they identified the same guy. This guy did it. Now, can I go to trial and say, well, wait a minute, you don't have a fifth witness? Well, okay, yeah, but the four who were there who saw it, they described him. The question is, they might be lying. Okay, they might have some reason to frame this guy. Let's test them. But if they pass the test, why do we need a fifth witness? We've got four who were there, who
Yeah.
saw it. If there had been a fifth there, we would have five accounts. So, in other words, and at some point, it's like you might have six or seven people there, but they're like, hey, the first four, they've already described it. Yeah, we agree. So the question is, why is it you don't trust the four who were in the house? We would just test them, and if they passed the test, we would say we don't need a fifth, a sixth. We don't even need to have access if there were 10, but the
Mm.
other six have died. We don't even need access to them because we've tested these four and they passed the test. So I think part of it is when I hear people say, "Well, you have no," is because they don't inherently trust the Gospels at all. Well, I didn't either. So it's a matter of testing the Gospels. Now, but let's just put it this way: it's interesting that Jesus has an impact. If Jesus is who he said he was, I would expect there to be people who saw it and
Right.
recorded it and could pass the test. And I would also expect there to be a huge ripple effect on the fabric of time, culture, civilization,
Hmm.
history, if he is who he said he was. So, in other words, if you're going to throw this rock in the pond, I'm going to expect somebody to be able to tell me, well, who threw the rock? Like what happened when the rock was thrown? And then I would expect to see huge ripples. So I should see some movement on the bank of the shore if there really was a rock thrown into that pond. And that's what I'm seeing in history. A matter of fact, the kind of
Mm.
impact that is unparalleled. And you got to ask yourself the question of the three possibilities. Jesus is either just a guy, or he's a fictional story, or he is who he said he was, man, myth, or Messiah. Which of these three descriptions fit the kind of impact he's had? So there's a sense in which, yes, the impact alone can tell me a great deal about the kind of person Jesus is, because I can't think of another fictional character. I mean, even in the past or
Yeah.
even theoretically in the future, they could have this kind of impact on art, literature, music, education, science, and world religions like Jesus of Nazareth. No one's had that kind of impact. And what I often will hear is people will say, well, yeah, he had that impact because, the conquering nations, forced him upon the other civilizations. Okay, first of all, remember that when Rome adopted Christianity, no government, no civilization was more familiar with the plethora of world religions than Rome.
Mm.
Rome would conquer areas and they would allow those people to keep their religions and keep their gods as long as they just melded them into the Roman pantheon of gods. And
Hmm.
that pantheon became larger. It's not like they weren't aware of every
Right.
religious offering, but only one claim about God changed the empire. So the question isn't, well, it's why would Jesus be the one to have this kind of impact that would lead to the development of science and art and literature and music, and even the way other people who think about God adopted Jesus into their systems? Why is Jesus the one when there's so many other claims that preceded Jesus that you could argue had larger people groups than Jesus had, yet had no impact on those six areas like Jesus had? So I think you can look at other aspects of culture. And here's what I would say: it's not just, and this is what I tried to do in Person of Interest, it's not just that he had a huge impact
Hmm.
on those other areas, it's that you could reconstruct the story of Jesus in its entirety from those diverse, weird aspects of culture And so if you didn't have a New Testament, if you it didn't have the documents that we must have in order to know anything about Jesus, but if those were all destroyed by some evil regime, and you had the writing, for example, of the church of the science fathers, every foundational scientist who has uh, innovated a discipline in the sciences, and the vast majority of them are believing Christians who also wrote about Jesus. So if you had the personal journals of the science fathers, you could learn more about Jesus than you could from the personal journals of the church fathers.
Mm,
And that to me is striking. From the history of art, you can reconstruct every scene of the Gospels. From the history of music, you can reconstruct not just the life of Jesus, but the theology of Orthodox Christianity. From the history of literature, from non-Christian voices in that period of time between the appearance of Jesus and the Constantine and the Roman Empire. So if you don't trust, well, yeah, Rome kind of adopts Christianity and they conquer the world. So we need to know what was being said about Jesus pre-Constantine. We call those the ante-Nicene church fathers. Well, that period of time between 1 AD and say 325 AD,
hmm.
well, that period of time, there's lots of non-Christian voices that are also on ancient manuscripts. You can collect and learn more about Jesus from non-Christian voices on ancient manuscripts before 325 than you can from Christian voices in that period. It's because that's the ripple. Now, you could argue, well, yeah, but Jim, that's too late. Well, yeah, okay, I get it. In any crime, I'm going to have the people who saw it, which I need to test,
Right.
and then the people they told it to, which if nothing else can at least tell me how early they were making these claims. And I need to look at both of those, and I can follow that. And so for example, if I get a guy who shows up 60 years later and says, well, I didn't ever tell, 40 years later, I never said anything back then, but I want to make a claim now. Well, I need to be able to trace as the story changed over time. Well, you could do
Mm,
all of that with the Gospels. And
wow.
if you do, you're going to find that, yeah, they passed the test. And then there's sufficient ripple that I would think is probably appropriate if Jesus is who he said he was.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible. And this actually is really good because it leads into three parts that I want to examine and we like to do on challenging conversations is where how can we equip Christians in these everyday conversations, whether it's at school, work, whatever their sphere of influence may be, of how you can take the evidence that we have for Jesus and make the case for Christianity to a Muslim, to a secularist, or to a skeptic or a New Age person, whatever the case may be. So this leads me to one of the first objections that I wanted to bring to your attention. And this has to deal with the copycat savior, because like you said, as people say, oh, well, all that evidence you just talked about, Jim, it was just copied. They took from pagan here, pagan that, and so Osiris and all that kind of stuff. And you, of course, do a great job elaborating. And this is something that we all, as apologists, have to do to some extent. When the case is being made against Christianity, supposedly these objections are brought against Christianity, saying Jesus is just a copycat. Over time, with all those resources you just said, Jim, they inserted Jesus, or to dignify him or to deify him, they would just take from Caesar or they take from this god or whatever the case may be. How should we respond when somebody uses this objection to try to discredit Christianity?
Well, first of all, you have to know what it is they're talking about, but I suspect they may not know what it is they're talking about. So the
Yep.
first good question you can ask is, show me what the one copy that you think
Yep.
is most objectionable. Like what is it that you think has been copied? And they're going to offer something, the double dying and rising Savior. Okay, what? Just tell me what is the mythology that you're pointing to that you think Jesus, the Jesus creators, the mythicists stole. If it's Osiris, like what aspect of the Osiris story is it you think? Now, what you're going to discover is that there are no parallels to Jesus, but there are broad similarities between all descriptions of gods over all generations, including now. So, for example, if you met someone today and they were unaware of any religious worldview. They were unaware of any formulation of Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism or whatever it may be. They just are out there someplace on the planet where they have no idea what has ever been discussed about God. And you said, well, do you believe there's some higher power? Yes. Well, describe for me what you think that higher power would be like. What you're going to get is a series of descriptions that match the descriptions of the ancients. If there's a God, he probably can work miracles. If there's a God, he probably came into the world in a weird, miraculous way, right? He would be God. If there's a God, he can probably defeat death. If he's a God who loves me, he could probably, if he's a God, he's probably a creator God. He has the power to create. These are generalities that you
Yeah.
see in all descriptions of gods, both in antiquity and presently on planet Earth by people who are just thinking about God, but have no really understanding of any other prior formulation of God. Okay, well, that's what I'm seeing too.
Yep.
But if you're going to say, for example, Mithras, which is one of the big ones,
Mm-hmm.
Mithras is born of a virgin in a cave. Okay, that sounds like it's similar. And he has 12 disciples. Well, that sounds kind of okay. Well, do you know what the truth about that is? Because the truth is that Mithras, there's not a lot of written information about Mithras except what Christians were writing about Mithras believers in the earliest centuries. It's a mystery religion. Most of what we know about Mithraism is basically from sculptures, from artwork, and from descriptions of people who were watching them.
Mm-hmm.
It does appear that, yes, Mithras emerges from the side of a mountain, leaving a hole. That's very, to me, telling because it's common to what we see. Oh, Mithras was born of a virgin in a cave. Okay, well, the story is he emerges from the side of a mountain. Now, but that's not born of a virgin in a cave. Okay, that's a big stretch, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is artwork in which he is depicted surrounded by the 12 signs of the zodiac. That does not mean he had 12 disciples. So
Right.
we stretch these things in order to make similarities. What we do know is that, yes, Mithras, like other ancient claims, appears in the world in a miraculous way because people who think about God think he's probably going to appear in the world in a miraculous way. Mithras did form disciples more than likely. Okay, in that story. Well, yeah, because if you're thinking about God, you'd think he's probably going to form followers.
Mm-hmm.
This is very common. The question then is, are any of these things true? Yeah, it turns out that the way we're going to imagine, we are created in the image of God. When we think about God, we're likely to get some things right and a lot of things wrong. The only question is, are any of these formulations true? And the other question is, are any of them based on documented eyewitness accounts in which they claim to have seen these things with their own eyes at a particular time in history, located in a particular region in the world, and they're making claims that can be corroborated in some way? Well, that's what we're looking at. There's none that doesn't exist for Mithras or for Osiris or for anyone. It exists for Jesus because this is
Right.
not a story that says, once upon a time story. This is a story that starts with an account based on a genealogy of the birth of the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very different kind of account. But the first thing you got to ask is, well, what is the mythology that you think there's a similarity with? And then you better know. And so what we did in Person of Interest is, we went back and chronicled all of those major mythologies that people say are similar to Jesus, and we kind of show that this is not similar to Jesus at all, but they do have 15 common characteristics that anyone who's thinking about God, whether in the past or in the future, typically attributes to God. And isn't it interesting that Jesus is the only deity that meets all of the expectations? So, for example, I've formulated 15 common expectations, but none of the ancient mythologies contain more than about 10. Jesus, though, has all 15 expectations we would hold in antiquity or in the present day for what God might do and who God might be. So, in other words, when C.S. Lewis says that Jesus is not the myth created from the minds of poets and ancient thinkers, he is the myth from the mind of God. He's not using the word myth as to say a fabrication. He's using the word myth to say a narrative about God. And that narrative about God happens to be, so for example, I can make things up. Witnesses can make things up. But if there's one who actually saw it, who says the truth, am I to discard the truth telling witness because there might be others who have lied? No, we're going to test all of them. If one passes the test, we're going to camp right there.
Mm. Yeah. That's, I mean, and you do a great job in the book too, looking at the other false deities that they try to represent and say that Jesus copied Christianity, when actually over time a lot of that mythology started to try to insert prophetic meaning or significance that was related to Jesus in the Jewish scriptures when that was not relevant or even present hundreds of years prior to that.
Well,
So if
yeah,
anything,
this
there,
this is
yeah,
yeah, and that's
bring that
another
up.
really good point.
Yeah,
That's
bring
another
that
really
up.
good point in the sense. Well, first of all, if you look at the similarities between Osiris and Buddha, So if you just look at the broad 15 characteristics that people describe about God,
Right.
and I made a list of all these, you'll find that there's a number. No one's claiming that Buddha is a recreation of Osiris, though. But
Yeah.
why not? Why not? If you're going to take this approach where any common similarity is, you can say, is borrowed, and when these common similarities are simply the things we would attribute to God anyway,
Yeah.
it's like this is not to me impressive. Not only that, you're arguing that Jews, the one group which we know from Scripture, was told repeatedly, "You are not to worship the gods of those pagans." And it's in our 10 commandments, right? Like this is the
Hmm.
biggest offense. Our God is a jealous God, it says. You are not to worship those idols when I am the true God. You think this is the group of all groups that you can cobble together a story from pagan mythology
Mm.
and sell it to first century Jews as the Messiah? I mean, I think if you're going to do this, if you're going to fabricate Jesus, the one thing you're going to be careful to avoid is any similarity
Right.
to pagan mythology, because this is the one thing that early Jews. And so if you're looking at a story written by Jews for Jews in a Jewish environment, I suspect you're stretching it to think they can steal from non-Jews to cobble their story together.
Yeah, I mean, well said. That's really good stuff. All right, so that's the first objection about when people try to argue against the credibility of Christianity by saying it's a copycat religion. The second objection I want to bring to people's attention is, and this is something you talk about in Person of Interest, early Christians eliminated competing accounts of Jesus. So, again, this one is addressing these different portrayals of Jesus. And so over time, people made Jesus into this deified character. And a lot of times people would try to land it, as you were saying earlier, in the Constantine era, right? Is that's when at the Council of Nicaea, he becomes deified. We start worshiping him as Christ, but never do we have any resources up to this point of Jesus declaring himself to be God. So how would you respond to somebody who makes this objection? Like the traditional view of Jesus represented in the canonical gospels can't be trusted because there were so many different versions of Jesus in history.
Okay, that's a great. I mean, this is so. First of all, it you would say that if your family came to you and said, Jason is not your dad, you would probably defend the fact that you are. So why would you be surprised that when people start to distort the story of Jesus, that there will be an attempt to defend the truth about Jesus? And we saw this all the time with the non-canonical gospels that came out of North Africa, that the earliest Christians would see coming in late, and they would call them out. These are late. They're not true. That's okay to do. Now, here's the objection I hear all the time. You don't have anything early about Jesus. Therefore, this is a creation that comes hundreds of years after
Mm-hmm.
people who would have known Jesus are already
Yep.
dead. So this idea that Jesus is God, for example, what a joke that is, right? This is something that comes out of a church council in the 4th century. This is not something that was an early claim. So here's what I would do: look, like I said, what's the great thing about the impact of Jesus, if you're just studying the impact, is that you can study all the ripples that exist in ancient literature before the Council of Nicaea. Because usually it's the Council of Nicaea where people will point to and say that's where the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
started, under Constantine in Rome, shaping this form of Jesus that he could use to control the world. Okay, so let's take a look at what's being said about Jesus from non-Christian sources. And when I say non-Christian, so I assembled a diagram of these in the book. This is both pagans. When I say pagans, I don't mean bad people. I simply mean non-Christians and Jewish authorities, because there's a lot of Jewish sources also. Now, look, all this is going to tell us is we don't have to trust any of it is true, but if nothing else, these non-Christian sources in the 300 years can at least tell us what Christians are saying. Like, what are the claims? Because they're going to refute these claims. They're going to argue against these claims. Jesus is not God. He's from this devil. He is. They're
Mm.
going to refute the claim. Okay, well, the claim has to exist in order for you to refute it. So what's good about reading those ancient voices in the first 300 or 400 years is you can at least see what the early claims are. And then you
Right.
got to argue. This is such a broad conspiracy. It doesn't just involve the 4 gospel authors. It involves anyone in the first 325 years who had access, because when they're writing about it, they're also lying. Okay, this gets to be a bit of a stretch. And so that's why I think it's important for us, number one, this is why early dating is so important.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to argue even, for example, to argue that Jesus is just a cobbled together mythology, well, then you have to argue that there's no real Jesus. And it's easier to lie about Jesus or invent Jesus if you do it after everyone who lived in the first century is dead.
Mm.
So if this is a second century story, then it's harder to even do anything with it to know for certain. But if you can date this within the first century, and that's what I tried to do in a book called Cold Case Christianity, well, then you're stuck. It's harder to lie about something when people who are there, who saw it, are still alive. And that's why early dating solves a lot of other problems. It doesn't just solve the problem of, well, is this testable? It solves the problem of, is this a mythology? Okay, well, if it's a mythology, that means there could not have really been a real Jesus. But these were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses and within the lifetime of people who would have known if there was a Jesus. So I think that's what makes it harder to lie if it's early. So I think in the end, and I've traced the story of Jesus. If you're looking for the nature of Jesus as the miraculous miracle worker who was born of a virgin, who died on a cross, who rose from the grave, who ascended into heaven, that version of the Jesus story dates back not just to the Gospels, it dates back to the first readers of the Gospels, to the students of the eyewitnesses like Polycarp and Papias and Ignatius, to the next generation like Irenaeus, to the next generation like Hippolytus, to all of the readers of Paul like Clement and
Mhm.
Linus and all the people who were under Paul's authority. You can trace this heel to toe from teacher to student throughout the centuries. And what you're going to find is, yeah, the story hasn't changed. That version of Jesus we're talking about, which is the one that I found most troublesome. Look, Jesus could be a preaching rabbi, but this whole glorified holy man who actually works miracles, I rejected. But that is the first claims. Those are the earliest. You won't find a simpler version, a redacted version of Jesus anywhere in history in the 300 years leading up to the Council of Nicaea. So you're stuck with that version. You can interpret it, and this is what happens, right? Okay, so how do I? He claimed to be God. He did the things of God. He said he came from the place of God. He used the word "I am." He accepted the worship of humans. How do I infer? What do I infer from that? Well, I get that. There's been arguments about how to infer properly from all of that data. But I'm interested, is the data there? And the data's there. Now,
Yeah.
how humans can separate on how they infer that data. Is he all man? Is he all God? What's the union between God and man? I mean, we can debate the formulations of this, but what are we debating? We're debating based on the data we have from antiquity. So
Yeah.
we're looking at the same data, we're just coming to different inferences. But that's true of humans. I mean, if you're looking at data from science, we're going to debate the data and the inference from the data. This is just the nature of it is to be human. And we do the same thing with Jesus.
Well, and that's key too, and that's what I'm encouraging all of our watchers and listeners is if you've never investigated that true version of Jesus that is the centerpiece of Christianity, we encourage people to do so because to your point, Jim, is whether you are talking to somebody who's New Agey or a Muslim or secularist, clearly progressive Christians, this is what they like to argue is that there are different versions of Jesus and it was Paul that won the day and over time
Right.
Constantine with the bishops and this ecclesiastical supremacy, they
Right.
overrode what other different versions of Christianity used to be, whether it be Gnostic or paganistic, whatever. And this is how they try to discredit and what they call the traditional view of Jesus when we're saying, no, this is the historic Orthodox Christianity from day one. And it's
Right.
very clear if you trace it back from the Jewish scriptures, the prophecy of the Messiah to come, virgin born, performing miracles, dying on the cross for sins, and rising from the dead. And clearly, as you look at the Gospels and even references outside of it, as you do so well in your book, Jesus claimed and fulfilled that he is God. So, one of the last things I wanted to end on this episode is because it's so prevalent in the world, and even in America, and that is engaging Muslims. And you mentioned towards the end of the book, there's different levels or different religious perspectives that people do have that have objections, or there are different viewpoints that they have about Jesus and how to rightly respond with grace and truth. So I want to ask you this question. What does the Quran say about Jesus? And how can a Christian use those sort of details that are mentioned and how Muslims, respond to people about Jesus? How can we use that to show them that he in fact is the Messiah, the Son of God?
Much of the data that is, generally speaking, available for the overarching story of Jesus is available in the Quran. And some of the roles of
Mhm.
Jesus as the judge of the living and the dead, that is also affirmed in the Quran. But here's the trigger point that makes the difference is the resurrection. They don't believe that Jesus died on a cross. They don't believe that he died and rose. And as a matter of fact, there's Ahmadi Muslims who believe that Jesus actually didn't die on the cross. He actually lived and visited them in their region of the world. So, I mean, there are lots of different, but the idea that Jesus is not foreign to Muslims, but the kind of Jesus that we're
Mhm.
describing. And so, really, what it comes down to is that Jesus is a prophet of higher authority, of higher respect and respectability than Muhammad, but he is not God. And their argument always you see it all the time on our YouTube videos. You see people will comment is that God is one, and this is blasphemy to suggest that. So we have a triune view of God. And so what we have to do with Muslims is to present the evidence for the resurrection.
Mhm.
Because if you're going to say, I trust some of the Gospels, if Muhammad trusted some of the Gospels, which were already in existence for hundreds of years before anything was described in the Quran, if you're going to trust the Gospels for something, the question then becomes, why don't you trust it for everything? If you can't trust it for the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, then why in the world trust it for anything? Like, what is the divider that is keeping you from one over the other,
Mm.
right? So I think part of it is what to make a case for the resurrection, but even more importantly, our theology describes the world the way it really is, and you're going to have a harder time describing the world the way it really is in Islam than you are under Christianity, because the role of men and women, the respect that the New Testament has for women is out. You can't. There's no comparison here. But more importantly, the God of the New Testament is described as love.
Mhm.
Not God can love. God makes love possible. No, God is love. This cannot be said of Allah, and here's why. If that version of God is true, then there would be nothing to love until you create the humans that you love. There's a lover and a beloved only when there's a beloved.
Mm.
So that means that God would have to learn under that formulation how to love at the point he wouldn't know this innately. He would only experience love at the point of creating the thing that he could love. Under our formulation, God is triune in nature. It is the lover, the beloved, and the spirit of love between them that is eternal. It could be said truly and righteously that God is love if it's Yahweh. But it cannot be said if God is love, if it's Allah, not because you're going to say, well, I can point to all these things that are vile or that are offensive or that are destructive. Forget about that. Just under a theological formulation, he's not triune in nature. Now, is there a mystery in this? Yeah. Would
Mhm.
you? First of all, I'm not inclined to worship a God that I can completely understand
Right.
anyway. Because if
Exactly.
there's something out there that matches your expectations, all your desires are met, every way you think is the way you think your God thinks, that's not God. That's you. That's not
That's
God.
right.
Just if there is a God, he's going to turn your way of thinking upside down.
Wow.
Is you're going to find yourself constantly saying, "Oh my gosh, how could I be this wrong?"
Mm.
If there's a mind that we say we think is the mind of God. So I think in the end, there's this mystery of the triune nature of God is an incredibly important theological point for us as Christians. And I think it makes sense in that there is a mystery in it, yet that mystery explains so much about the nature of God. And to the point where you could say that God is love, but only under that formulation. So I think that there's some ways to kind of approach Muslims because I think everyone wants to be loved and wants and thinks that they're worshiping a God that at least we could say that God Yahweh has experienced love forever. It's
Yeah.
part of his nature. He is love because of the triune formulation of God, where any other God has to create something in order to love it. This is not the case for Yahweh.
Yeah, and it's an amazing too. Even when they call it the Injils, right? When you look at the Gospels that they believe in, they hold to that he performed miracles Muhammad didn't, and that he did things that Muhammad couldn't do. And there's this reverence that already Muslims have for Jesus, and we as Christians just need to be bold enough with the evidence and the passion that we have to be able to engage Muslims with it. So highly recommend The Person of Interest for anybody who's interested to dive deeper
Well,
into
and,
knowing
and
more about
Jason,
Jesus. Yeah.
and one more thing about this, Jason, too, is that I think we're at a point right now, and you probably agree because you and I do a lot of work
Yeah.
in the same venues with young people, is that we used to make this case all the time, like, why is this true? Is it true? Is it true? Is it true? And I think that really that has moved in this generation to, is it good? Is it good? Is it good? Now, I'm not saying that we should be focused entirely on whether it's good or whether it's practical, but the reality of it is that Christianity is
That's right.
taking a beating because people don't think it's good. Well, trust me, this is why it's important for us to shift our work. If you're comparing Christianity to Islam, the
Mm,
question of is it good is, I think, a little bit easier to handle because you would have to at least argue that Islam has not. And by the way, a lot of Muslims were involved in the sciences, for example,
that's
until
right.
about the 13th century, and then they pretty much dropped off the map. And why does that happen? Well, there's a book called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. But the point is that Muhammad did not have the impact on art, literature, education, music, science, and world religions that Jesus did. He just hasn't.
Hmm.
And so the richness, the goodness of literature and art and music that has come out of a Christian worldview, in which the leaders in these areas have been Christians, is pretty robust, especially when compared to Islam. So if the question is it good? We need to start talking about that because it turns out, yeah, it's not just true, it's good.
Yeah, that's well said. I appreciate you ending it on that note, Jim. So, Jim, as we close, I want to, one, thank you for your ministry. Thank you for your diligence and your partnership and your friendship all these years, and just continue to pray that God will continue to anoint you. But if somebody wants to go deeper, obviously they can get The Person of Interest. But what other resources that you have available on your website and elsewhere that you want to encourage people to go check out?
Yeah, well, I think right now, I mean, look, I'm getting older, so a lot of this we're trying to kind of consolidate it and make it available to people because at some point there's going to have to be somebody else who takes the lead in this.
That's true.
So what we tried to do is put together a 10-hour case makers course. You'll see it on the banner at
Mm,
coldcasechristianity.com. Just click that. Yeah, we do leverage our books in order to teach that course, but it's 10 hours of video where you really are looking at all these visual presentations we made over the last 10 years to try to make the case visually. And that's one of the things I'm pretty committed to. It's not just that I'm going to make the case and show you some visuals. It's that I'm trying to figure out, how do I speak with images? How do I speak? So if you didn't have me talking, would it still make sense visually? Because in front of juries, that's a very powerful tool. And that's why, for example, in Person of Interest, there's 400 illustrations. Well, because this is a visual case. I actually asked Zondervan, the publisher, to allow me 2 years to build the visual case before
mm.
I started writing the book so that it would inform the process.
Wow,
So
that's
I think
good.
this is what we tried to do up at coldcase.com.
Well, I appreciate that, man. And I definitely encourage people to go to coldcasechristianity.com. I've been on that site many, many times with articles. Even one of my latest books I wrote, Hijacking Jesus, used some of Jim's research and guidance to help me make sure that we are, like you said, not just graphically, visually, but also logically and reasonably putting together a case for Christianity that is compelling in the age that we live in today. So, Jim, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate you, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Well, my friends, thank you guys for listening and watching this another episode that we're having about the fascination of Jesus Christ as we're celebrating this Christmas season. Let me just say, I encourage you guys, if you want to build the knowledge that you want to have, that you envision that you would have, that there are resources available, whether you go to standstrongministries.org or you go check out coldcasechristianity.com to see all of the amazing resources that Jim has put together with his research through the years, whether it was writing his cold case book or this recent book that we were discussing about called The Person of Interest. Check those things out and make sure that when you guys are listening to this episode, you guys leave us a review and share it with your friends out there, because we know that we need to be having these challenging conversations and we're not to back down, but allow the Holy Spirit to use us in a mighty, powerful way. Until next time, keep having those challenging conversations.